Goal number 4 is to evaluate functions, 3 different types. We're looking at our absolute value, rational, and radical. First 3, f of -10, g of -1, h of -4 will have answers. Okay, so they're just plugging in, find the y value or find the output value. But the last 2 that I added, these will be our little introduction to domain of rational and square root functions. So we'll take a look at these 2. But first, let's evaluate these 3 function values. So first of all, I have f of -10. So plug in -10, plug in x equals -10 right there into f of x. Okay, so that's going to be f of -10 equals absolute value of -2 times -10 plus 5. -2 times -10, negative times negative is positive. So 20 plus 5 will give us 25. And absolute value of 25 is just 25 because 25 is 25 away from 0. Okay? You guys have a scientific calculator, right? So if I double check, or if I want to just, type it in just to see, I can check absolute value of -2 times -10 plus 5, close the absolute value bar. That does come up to be 25. So if you want to use your scientific calculator to check your arithmetics, that will be great. Okay, next one. I'm going to evaluate, what's the second one? G of -1. Let's plug in -1 into g. Ooh, look, that's a rational function. It's a fraction function. So when I plug in -1 into g, I have to plug in -1 on top and in the bottom. So I'll go ahead and make that substitution. So take a look. That's going to be 1 plus -1 cubed over -1 minus 3. Okay? The bottom of the fraction is -1 minus 3. That is -4. The top of the fraction, well, this will be 1 plus -1, right? Because if you multiply -1 by itself 3 times, that's going to be -1. So take a look at the numerator. The numerator becomes 1 minus 1. That is 0. So when the top of the fraction is 0, the entire fraction becomes 0 because we're dividing nothing. We're dividing 0 by -4. Now, if you want to, check your answer, we can type this in here too. So take a look. I got my Desmo Scientific Calculator open. I can do fraction button. 1 plus -1 cubed over whoopsies. Let me go down to the bottom of the fraction. -1 minus 3. That comes out to be 0. I always check my work just because, when you're doing your homework on Alex, if you make a tiny little mistake, it's going to take you back and ask you to do one more question. So I would always check answers. All right, let's do the last one. It says find h of -4. So this time, let's plug in -4 into this square root function. Because I'm worried a little bit. Because if I plug in a negative under square root, now, let's a quick review of square root. You know what square root of 25 is? That's 5. But what about square root of -25? See, that's not -5. That is actually undefined. Well, you can't have a negative number under square root. Like you can't have square root of -49. Negative radicands, this is not real. Why? Let's talk about that real quick. Because what they are saying is, what times what? When you square a number, like what number squared will give you -25? Well, obviously, 5 squared is 5 times 5. That's positive 25, right? But even if you square a -5, what happened? If you do negative number times a negative number, that comes out to be a positive number. So that's not a real number. Okay, that's not possible. So until we talk about imaginary numbers, complex number system, when we have a negative underneath the square root, negative radicand, we're going to say that's undefined. Okay, but I'm sorry, I was kind of going ahead of what I wanted to talk about later on. But for right now, let's go ahead and plug in. Okay, what is h of -4? If you plug in -4 right there, that's going to be -4 minus 5 times -4, which is big square root of. Look, that's a good news. Negative times negative is positive. So I will get -4 plus 20, right? Now this is same as 20 minus 4, and 20 minus 4 is 16. And you know that's perfect square. Square root of 16 is 4. Therefore, yay, this was a real answer. This was a real number. Now, if I'm wondering if I got this right, I just want to double check my math. I will come over here and type this in. Okay, what was the work that we did? It is square root of -4 minus 5 times times -4. And that does come out to be +4. So this is the Desmo scientific calculator that I'm using to check my work whenever I'm working on my computer. All right, let me keep on going. Now these two questions are fun. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another page. I'm going to add another page to talk about them. I'll copy this question down here along with these two functions that we're going to use. Okay, the rational function and then this square root function. Hold on. This square root function. Because now we're going to talk about domain of rational function and square root function. So let's start with g of 3. Okay, so if you plug in 3 into g, let's see what happens. Okay, let's see what happens. If you plug in 3 into g, that's going to be 1 plus 3 cubed on top of the fraction. But what about the bottom of the fraction? That's going to be, oh no, 3 minus 3. And 3 minus 3 is 0, right? And it really, at this point, it doesn't matter what's on top of the fraction. Because when you have 0 in the bottom of a fraction, I mean, you can't have that. You can't have 0 as the denominator. Okay? In math, you are not allowed to divide by 0. So it doesn't matter what the numerator is. The numerator, I think, is 28. When you have 0 in the bottom of the fraction, you're going to have to say this is undefined. Okay? Let me double check. Okay? If I plug in 3 into this function, I'll go ahead and type this in. Okay, I'll show you. So fraction bar, 1 plus 3 cubed on top of the fraction. And in the bottom of the fraction, I have to do 3 minus 3. Take a look at what the calculator says. It's undefined. So when you have 0 in the bottom of the fraction, well, the expression is undefined. So I want you to write down a very important rule here, okay? Rule number 1, okay? Denominator cannot be equal to 0. And this is the rule that you and I will use whenever we are asked to find a domain of a rational function, okay? Because we're not allowed to have 0 in the bottom of a fraction, okay? Now let's look at the second one, the h of 1. Let's see what kind of restrictions we have for square root functions. So what is h of 1? I'm going to plug in 1 into this function, okay? So that's going to be square root of -4 minus 5 times 1, right? That is square root of -4 minus 5, because -5 times 1 is just 5, or -5. So let me keep on going. I should add this to my favorite color. So what's this? Square root of -4 minus 5 is -9, and this is not -3. Because look, -3 squared is actually +9. This is not -3. A lot of people think it is, but it's not. So what is square root of -9? It's actually not real. Okay, it's not a real number. So let me show you. What are they gonna say if I type this square root of -9? They're gonna say, hey, that's undefined. You can't have a negative number under square root. Okay, because if you do that, that's an imaginary number. Okay, so we're gonna have to say this is also undefined until we go and explore the imaginary numbers in the complex number system. We're gonna go ahead and say that is not a real number. That's undefined. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you the second rule. Rule number 2. When you're working with square root function, I want you to remember that radicand. Okay. All right. Hold on a second. Radicand cannot be negative. And you know, I forgot to define what radicand is for you. Radicand refers to whatever is under the square root. Okay? So whatever is under the square root should not be negative. Okay? So you know what's not negative? Positive, right? So we're talking about positive numbers. But you gotta remember there's this odd guy. It's not negative or positive. What number is that? This number is not negative. This number is not positive. What kind of number is in the middle? These are the positive to the right. These are the negatives to the right. So what about 0? Can a radicand be 0? Okay, so the question that I should ask you is, can we have square root of 0? Is that okay or is that not okay? So my question is, I know it cannot be negative. I know it can be positive, but can it be 0? Well, let's explore that a little bit, okay? So I'm going to type in a whole bunch of numbers. Can I have a positive number? Yeah. Square root of +9 is 3. Square root of 12.5, I mean, it's an ugly decimal, but it's still a number. So all the positive numbers are going to be okay. You and I saw that square root of anything negative is going to be undefined. What about square root of 0? Can we have square root of 0? It looks like when it says 0, that they're not saying it's undefined. Square root of 0 is 0. So I want you to make a note that radicand can be equal to 0. So add the note. Let's go ahead and write the rule. Radicand can be greater than or equal to 0. I say greater than because numbers that are bigger than 0 are the positive numbers, right? But it's very important that you add that symbol greater than or equal to instead of simply greater than. Okay, so this is the correct rule. And the incorrect, let me go ahead and write down the incorrect, the wrong one. This is wrong to say radicand is greater than 0. Okay, because we just saw that it can actually be equal to 0. So when you are writing your restrictions for these square root functions, I want you to make sure that you use the correct symbol. Say that the radicand is greater than or equal to 0. Now, I boxed these two important rules. So rule number 1, I'll go ahead and say this is rule number 1, is that the denominator cannot be equal to 0 because when denominator is equal to 0, the function is going to be undefined. Okay, now for the square root function, this is my rule number 2. The radicand has to be greater than or equal to 0 because if it's a negative number, the number is undefined, right? So we saw those on these two examples. I'm going to stop this video and I will come back and record the next one where I'm going to talk about goal number 5, domain of a rational function. So I'll be back very soon.